Tech on Demand is back with yet another video presentation intended to arm you with information to produce your best crops ever. I'm Bill Calkins, and the topic du jour is one that's on the minds of just about every grower I talk to these days. And most of you are going to be on different levels with this subject. Some are going to be experts, or at least have trialed and tested these things, and some are just dipping their toes in the water. The topic is LED lighting, and it's a fairly complex topic, especially when you try to look at it for propagation, which we're going to do today. And the information is moving quickly. There's a ton of research being done in universities and in the companies that are manufacturing this technology, and plenty of real world greenhouse data coming back in. But how do you make sense of it all to determine if LEDs are right for your operation and when and where to use them? And that's the question on the table. And we are lucky to have someone with us today who has some answers and a lot of experience with LED lighting and lighting in general. He's not going to have all the answers, but he'll have a bunch of them. And it's my friend and tech on demand guru, Dr. Will Healy. Will's the senior technical and research manager at Ball Horticultural. And he's actually been doing lighting research since 1974. I didn't even know LEDs were around in 1974 or the light spectrums were being studied back then. So this is really going to be interesting. Will's been involved in more lighting research than just about anyone. And to list the studies he's been a part of would take all day. So I'm going to keep it brief and just say that Will is a student of light and the effects of light on biological systems. He's been intrigued with the possibilities of using specific wavelengths of light to reduce everything from pesticides and chemical usage and to produce super high quality plants for decades. More recently, he worked with Ball's international partners to determine the most cost-effective ways to use lighting in greenhouse production. So today's talk is going to cover a lot of the key opportunities and challenges you're going to need to address when incorporating LED lighting into your production areas. So Will, welcome, and we're going to call on your almost 50 years experience in this talk. How does that sound?
Well, it sounds like I've probably lit up a few things, but it's really probably the most exciting time in lighting. And lighting, as I've have learned over the years, because I have been doing this for a little bit, can be used in a lot of different ways to basically improve the overall quality and profitability of our business. And it all starts in propagation, because the old saying of garbage in, garbage out. So if we don't have good propagated material that's uniform and performing, then basically is all you're going to do is fight it all the way to the very end, and then usually sell either a subpar or nothing, which basically goes to your bottom line. So light and lighting is really a critical part of the propagation process. And so we're going to talk about this in a number of different, kind of as a beginner, and also how you can use it and how you should approach this if you're now suddenly entering in this crazy world of lighting. The first real issue is, for most growers, their mind, I think, Bill, you've written articles over the years on this and talked to growers, and the biggest challenge you've got is that they start getting into all of this scientific stuff and this confusing, and you feel like you're heading down a rabbit hole and 5 minutes has passed and you're just confused. Back in the olden days when we turned on high pressure sodium lights, it was really easy. You turned them on, magic happened. When you used incandescent, used it for photoperiod, but not anything else. And so it was a simple decision. Do you have the money? We know it works. But with LED lights, it's much more complicated. But on the other hand, hopefully by the time we're done, you're going to see that it's really a fairly simple decision, because we're going to stress on this is, what problem are you trying to solve? Very critical question when you go into this LED lights, because there's so many problems that can be solved, and you have to know your problem or problems so that you can get the right light quality, the right source to solve those problems. Otherwise, it is just a confusing rabbit hole. So let's take a look at what we're going to do. Let's do a little bit beginners, because I think it's important that we understand why certain lights work and certain lights don't. What we have here is a spectrum from 400 nanometers to 800 nanometers. You hear about this. This is how they measure light scientifically. And it's different colors as you move from 400, which is down in the ultraviolet and blue, all the way up to 800, which is the heat. You know, when you put your hand underneath incandescent light, or you put your hand underneath a high pressure sodium light, your hand gets warm. Well, that's because of the long wave radiation. On the other end, down by 400, you know, when you get sunburn, well, that's the ultraviolet wavelengths. So basically we have these, and everything in between is what's important. Now, over the years, you know, because I've been involved in this for a long time, you know, you got us old people like to talk about the history. You know, you have tungsten light, which basically is your incandescent light bulb, which basically emits light, as the chart shows, over a broad spectrum, with most of it in the infrared, the heat source. So it's not a very efficient from photosynthesis, which is down around the middle range, around 600 nanometers. Daylight fluorescent was much more linear, but the cost of running them was not very good. They were cheap to install, but they were expensive to run. You had some other kinds of lights that came and went over the 60s and 70s and almost even into the 1980s. Some of the mercury fluorescent have very specific wavelengths, but still the wrong ones for plant growth. And basically it was all or nothing. When you turn them on, you got them all. You couldn't really steer. Steering is using specific wavelengths of light to get specific growth response. And we'll talk about that. Low pressure sodium is why we don't use it. It's just very linear. So only a certain number of wavelengths, and it's really not good for photosynthesis. It's in the wrong wavelengths. High pressure sodium kind of hit the sweet spot for mini growing, and that's why you see so many high pressure sodium light installations. It was the first real light that basically allowed us to increase photosynthesis, because it was in that 600, 640 range, which is ideal. And it had a little bit of blue, but you know, if you just grow under high pressure sodium, you tend to get a lot of stretch, and we'll see why in a minute. When you get metal halide, you get another, but it's not, that is even less efficient than high pressure sodium. So we've had a lot of hits and misses over the years, but we have learned a lot from this. So let's talk a little bit about our friend LED. And I think we need to just kind of go back to the very simple basics of why would we do this? Because, you know, my first LED project was back, my first red and far red light study was in 74. And then by about 77, we actually had LEDs. And so I remember going and buying them. It was a major production to buy them, and they barely had any output. And since then, we've increased the output, the amount of light energy that's coming out the bottom of them significantly. And every year it keeps improving to the point where they're now starting to reach some engineering limitations on how much light they can get out, but it's very important. So if you look at why LED versus high pressure sodium, is basically you get more light converted for the energy you put in. It's the efficacy, how much light out for energy in. So you're not losing as much in convection heat, which is the stuff that's coming off the top, or the radiation heat, which is the heat that the light that you feel when you put your hand underneath the fixture, compared to high pressure sodium. And ultimately, you get more light out of a LED. So now we're getting into the cost effectiveness of running these and getting higher and higher light intensity at a lower and lower cost per kilowatt hour. So that's why LEDs have now become interesting in our part of the industry, and actually across all of lighting, whether you're talking about factory lighting or you're talking about residential or plant lighting. The fact that we get a lot of light out for very little energy in, or less energy in, makes them cost effective. But what are we really talking about? So let's talk about what an LED is. It's a very simple piece of engineering, but it's very complicated. Basically, you've got, if you look at the image, you've got a diode, and this diode is basically where the chemicals sit that they put an electric charge across. And when they put an electric charge across that diode, it emits light so that you get different light. And then they put some kind of covering over it to basically protect the diode. And of course, that covering, depending upon which one you have, can basically give you either a lot of light output or not. Because think of it as like that covering over it. It's kind of like a shade cloth of getting light out. So this is why you can go on the internet and buy cheap LEDs any day, every day. Been there, done that, used them. But the amount of light output for energy input, the kilowatts you're putting in, is not very good because they haven't really engineered that diode. And they haven't engineered that plastic piece that sits on top of it and protect it. And that's what you're paying for, is basically the engineering to give you maximum amount of light output. Okay, so let's just do a little pointy engineering for us horticulturists, which is going to be really short. Basically, how do they do this magic? Is, well, they find that they've got different semiconductor materials, different chemicals that they stir together in a witch's broom. And when you stir them together and put a little electricity on it, you get different colors of light. So depending upon what color kind of mixture you put on the diode, you get different light that comes out. Now, fun fact, but we're not engineers, we're horticulturists. What do we want to do with these? Well, let's talk about the plant growth responses that we get with these different colors of light. The infrared, which is the heat, and also far red light, which is a little bit shorter. Basically, you get stem elongation, you get flowering, you can get root development. It's very important to have some far red light in the mix. If you put red light, now red light was the first one. It's a very cheap LED to come up with, but red light basically is critical for photosynthesis. This is, remember I mentioned high pressure sodium lights work because they have the right wavelengths for triggering photosynthesis. Very important, because that's what drives the economics of this whole problem. My early research on branching clearly showed that red light promotes branching. And of course, we're selling branches. We sell bulk. Think of a mum crop if you're doing it during the fall. If you got a stick in the pod, that has no economic value. But if you get it to branch, so you fill out a 10-inch pod, that is where the value is. So branching is a key part of our industry because we want plants that basally branch, whether it's petunias, whether it's marigolds, whether it's name the crop, we like branching. But we also like flowering because we're selling flowering. As I always tell people when they say, well, what do you do? I say, well, I work for a company that we sell color, and green is not one of them. We're interested in a lot of color, and that's all about flowering. Let's switch down to blue, because blue is a really interesting light color, and it's really kind of entered the industry because of its application. It's involved with branching to a limited extent, but what it really brings to the table is compact growth. You light with blue light, you can get them very, very compact. But of course, if you don't have the red light, what do you got, Bill? Nothing, because you don't have photosynthesis, because we need to have the red for photosynthesis. That's why you see these red, blue, or as they appear to be pink or purple lamps and lighting, is because you've got this blend of red and blue. And it's really important to have the right blend, because if you have too much blue, they stay too compact. If you have too little blue, they get too stretched. If you get too much far red, they get very tall. And we're going to go through the pictures of the research that's done here in a minute. But suffice it to say, it's important to have the different kinds of light. Now, someone would say, well, I like white. Okay, well, if you have white, what do you have, Bill? You've got all of the spectra present. So it's the presence of all light spectra that are visible that gives you white light. Of course, now when you're trying to get energy efficiency, that means the energy in is giving you light out. So if you're getting a bunch of white light, you're basically getting a lot of this orange, yellow, and green light, which obviously the plant is probably using, but the general consensus as of today is that this whole green, middle, blue, yellow, orange, really we're not sure what it does, and it doesn't seem to have a huge impact. So even though you're putting energy in and a white light, and you're getting some of these other wavelengths, orange, yellow, and green, that makes it white, out, you're not getting the bang for the buck. This is why when you hear people say, well, I like white, well, that's because that's a personal preference so you can see better. But from an energy standpoint, from a plant standpoint, having the correct blend of red and blue is very, very important, especially if you can put just a little bit of far red in there to basically give the light spectrum that you need. So hopefully I haven't spent too much time, but it helps you understand that when you look at a light and you see what color it is, you have to ask yourself, is it the color I want to do the job I need? And that's going to be a critical part. Now, of course, if you look at the graph that I show, basically it talks about ultraviolet. And ultraviolet is an interesting if you're growing lettuce, or if you're looking at ultraviolet for insect or disease control. This is kind of avant-garde, it's kind of out there, but that's the beauty and the excitement in LED lights, is that we can get this steering concept. We can use monochromatic or very specific wavelengths of light to achieve our end goal, which is to achieve specific growth patterns. Because of course, as floriculturists, we're not interested in just getting big plants. We want to have plants that are the right size at the right time in the right numbers so we can make money at it. Because, yes, big plants are great, but if you can only put 2 shelves on a rack versus a better control plants where you can get 3 shelves on a rack, that's, a huge difference when you're getting around to shipping it. And of course, in today's transportation costs, it's very important to be able to do that. So let's talk a little bit about what are you doing? Julie Andrews summed it up best in Sound of Music for you old movie folks when she started saying, let's start at the very beginning. It's really important to start at the beginning when you're looking at LED lights and sitting down and saying, what's my problem? What are we trying to solve with LED lights? In our seedling program, is it germination? Is it hypocotyl stretch? Is it leaf unfolding? Is it carbohydrate accumulation? Is it flower initiation? Is it basal branching? Is it root development? What are we trying to do? Because if you use the right light quality, you can fix it. If you use the wrong one, it doesn't fix it. And the same as unrooted cuttings. Because remember, at the end of the day, uniformity of performance in young plants translates into dollars. 100% of the seedlings, 100% of the unrooted cuttings, hitting the right stage of development is what you have. Early and late doesn't count. It's all about an asynchronous development, which means that some are slow and some are fast, basically ends up creating shrink. And shrink is things you have to do to fix stuff that you don't get paid for. So this is the sweet spot we're looking for. So really sit down before you start asking what light I should buy, is ask yourself the question and write them down. What problem am I going to solve? So that when you sit down and talk to your partner in lighting, you can say, these are my main problems. What should I do to fix them? Because that's going to be really important. So let's talk about how do you decide what your problems are? I always like thinking about it in the 3 Ps, because lighting really is 3 different aspects that you can control. Because at the end of the day, we want to have more uniformity of our crop, all flowering on the same day, and we want them to flower faster so we can get more turns. Because those are the 2 economic considerations you have to achieve to basically create the payback on the use of LEDs or any lighting systems for that matter. Let's talk about what are the 3 Ps. The first one is photomorphogenesis. Bill, I don't know if I could get more letters into a word than that, but it sure is trying. And photomorphogenesis, basically think of it as the habit and size. Is it a stick in a pot? Is it a branch plant? Does it flower? Does it flower? Does it flower uniformly? How does the plant look? How does it size up? Photosynthesis. This is really what everyone seems to kind of focus on, but it's only a small part of the bigger picture. Photosynthesis is about producing carbohydrates, producing sugars that create starch that allow the plant grow. So it's not just about photosynthesis, because as floriculturists, as greenhouse operators, we just don't want big plants. We want the right size plant at the right time. So it's really important that not only do we have photosynthesis to get it to grow, but we also have photomorphogenesis to basically hit the habit. Now, photoperiod is important because it basically controls whether plants are big or small, whether it's flowering or not. So we need to have the right photoperiod to make sure that we get the plant to appear correctly, because we're selling an aesthetic. We're not selling tonnage of corn or tonnage of wheat or tonnage of cannabis. We're talking about selling a very specific plant that has a specific habit. So let's talk a little bit about some of the light quality and some of the research that's been done. There's a really great addition to the Grower Talks this week that just came out on lighting that Eric Runkle produced. Eric is the leader in floriculture lighting. And if you haven't followed Eric Runkle's from Michigan State's work, definitely get in there and read it, follow it, read up on it, because it's a very practical, simple way to do it. And the piece in Grower Talks this month is an excellent overview of that. But let's talk a little bit about some of the effects. Far red light. Far red light is one that's coming in. And notice FR is the abbreviation for far red. B is the abbreviation for blue. Notice that if you have blue, the more blue you have, whether you have 10 moles or if you have 50 moles of blue, then basically what it basically does is keeps them, the more the shorter. It's pretty simple to understand. The more the shorter. And then if you basically counteract blue by add far red, more far red, the taller. And then of course you can cancel out blue, the stretch from far red by adding blue. So blue plus far red is shorter than just blue or far red. So this is where all of a sudden you feel like, oh my God, I'm going down a rabbit hole. But think of it this way. Blue keeps you short, far red keeps you tall, red basically helps with carbohydrates. So, let's not overcomplicate it, because as Bruce Bugbee, probably the leader in light and light sensing, says, let's not overthink this. It's about photons. So let's take a look at some of the things that happen if you have high pressure sodium comparison, which is the plant, the second from the left. Is basically the more high pressure sodium you add, the taller, the more unfolded, because it's got all that infrared, that long wave red wavelength. So it's warmer, it grows faster. And as you start adding more red and different wavelengths, you can change the overall plant height. What's interesting is that if you have just red and far red, notice in the pictures that as you add more far red, the plants stretch more, whether you're talking about geraniums, petunias, or coleus, it basically, because far red causes stretching. Remember I mentioned earlier my work on red and far red, where we basically have red, it creates branching if applied correctly, and far red, it basically inhibits branching, so it causes stretch. And if you think of that seedlings, that they're stretching, what are they doing? They're looking for the light. So the far red light comes through the leaves, because far red filters, moves through the leaves and forces the plants to go looking for light. And so it's a mechanism that it's developed to be very effective. But if you add a little bit of blue, as this picture shows, basically as you add blue and far red, basically they can cancel each other out very nicely. So let's talk a little bit about also what happens in some other crops, that as you increase more far red. So it's, again, the more far red you add, the taller it gets. Just like the more blue you have, the shorter they get. So you can use the blue and red to steer the crop as being tall, or you can steer it to be short. What do you want to do? Or do you want to go right down the middle by having the right balance? And this is where having a partner who understands, and not someone that's on the internet who basically sells you LEDs, go for it. So if you need to have a partner, you need to have a partner who's going to actually know what is the right balance for the crop that you have. Because if you notice these pictures, every crop's a little different, and that's where they start talking about recipes. But let's not just talk about stretching and not stretching, but when we talk about photomorphogenesis, the use of light, there's a lot of different things that happens. And of course, one of the things is germination. Some crops, and of course, Begonia semperflorens is a poster child of this. How many times have you seen this on your begonia germination, where all of a sudden you see these stripes along the edge or on the end one part, but then you don't see it on the, and the rest of the plants are small. So you have small and larges. And then of course you go several weeks later and you go like, how did we do this? Well, it's because in the time between sowing and say 5 days before the seed is just starting to crack, it is photoreceptive, and it can basically change the growth rate. And it's photomorphogenesis. It's the growth rate on germination. There's a lot of seeds that require light for germination. Petunias, begonias, are just two very classic examples of if you don't put light on them, they don't germinate. Sometimes in patients, depending upon the age of the seed, can basically be light sensitive, and some varieties are more light sensitive than others. So there is all of this data out there that your partner knows about, that, okay, you need to make sure you've got light and uniform light, and what color of light you need to get more uniform. What's the difference in this begonias? By having lights on them, by lighting early, we were able to knock a minimum of a week, 7 days, which is economically viable on begonias because it's a long-term crop. But we were even able to, by pushing them even further, we were able to get up to 2 weeks shorter crop time during January when the greenhouse is starting to fill up, with using the lights at the appropriate time. And this is work that we've done over the years internationally. Ball being a large organization around the world, we have a very active LED research going on throughout the world in our young plant production to try to find how can we use lights to improve overall production. Hypocaudal stretch, I touched on this earlier with far red light. Remember, leaves don't filter out far red light. Far red light passes right through the leaf to the lower part of the plant, which then basically causes them to stretch. So clearly, I think, Bill, you'd agree that having a little blue light in germination, an early seedling, if once you get to the hook and start going up, probably would be a good use. And where they're using it in Europe is because Europe is going chemophobic, meaning that they're significantly restricting the use of chemicals throughout the life of the crop. So LED lighting, specifically steering with blue light or steering with red light or steering with specific wavelengths of light, has become a really important tool as they move from the chemophile world where we used a chemical for everything to a chemophobic world where chemicals are bad and we have to use alternative techniques. So now is the time to start understanding how can you use light, and specifically wavelengths of light, to steer the crop to achieve the objectives that you have. Probably one of the most powerful ones that we did, 50 years ago, and people are now starting to repeat this work, is the use of light, red light, blue light, far red light, to control basal branching. Because if you basically take a look at these two crops, these poinsettia crops, which we're heading into in the fall right now, and look at those two where you've got basal branches already growing versus you have nothing on the right, what you start realizing is that that plant on the left is probably, you could take a week to 10 days, maybe as much as 2 weeks off that crop, because you've already got the basal branches moving instead of having nothing. And you can also then have a fuller plant that is more attractive and it has a much higher value. The worst thing you can have is both of those plants, one that branches and one that doesn't, sitting on the bench next to each other, as in this case. Because when you have that, the question is, what are you going to do? Do you spray growth regulators? Not spray growth regulators. Do you feed? Do you not feed? What do you do? It's that lack of uniformity of development that's so critical. So using LED lights, specific light quality to steer the plant is a very powerful tool that we have. So photomorphogenesis, blue, compact, red, branching, far red, stretch. You can use these tools for or against whatever you want to use, but that's photomorphogenesis. Let's move on to what everyone talks about, which is photosynthesis. Remember, in its simplicity, photosynthesis is about producing sugar. Sugar basically allows us to have growth. So without good photosynthesis, active photosynthesis, we don't produce the sugar, we don't produce the sugar, we don't get the growth. It's a real simple process. Well, not really, because it depends upon how much growth do you want. Remember, what's your problem? What are you trying to solve? Because there's two different strategies out there. When we got into LEDs, it was very cost effective. And the first area you saw the implementation of LED lighting was, of course, in vegetable and leafy greens, cannabis production. And why you saw it there is because their strategy is maximum biomass production. Lots of plant. The more plant, the better the value. So, there was a study that was done that looked at using in this graph that shows 0 supplemental, 150 micromoles, 300 micromoles, 450 micromoles, 850 micromoles, and then looked at what was the increase in value of the cannabis biomass that was produced. And as you can see, the more light, it's a linear growth of the more biomass. The more biomass, the greater the value of the product. So there's if your objective is biomass production, that is a very different strategy than what we use in young plant production, which is really we're optimizing the biomass. We don't want them too big. We don't want them too small. We want them within a time window. We want them short and compact. We want this, we want that. I mean, we have some very specific specifications that we want. And so therefore, we're looking at, putting on in the picture that I presented some work that Roberto Lopez did, which basically 10 days after sticking of some new guineas, basically by having 1.3 moles per day versus 5.9, about 6 moles per day, notice that you significantly change the days to shipping. So, by 14 days, this crop is ready to rock and roll and ship. So all of a sudden you take something, whereas the plant that only had 1.3 moles, which is ambient light, that basically, if you got 4 weeks, 6 weeks, you probably could get the equal root mass as you did if you just put 5.9 moles of light on them and basically got faster rooting. Because remember, roots grow because there's carbohydrates. You got carbohydrates are the sugars. The sugars come from photosynthesis. So the more light you have, but you don't want to have so much light that the plants are too big. So we really want to be controlling that. So when we take a look at these DLI maps, and of course there's a number of excellent ones that have been developed over the years, and there's some others, they really do tell the story of what we're doing and where we do what we do. So if you take a look on the left-hand side of the United States, this is January. And remember, when you look at these DLI maps, that is the outdoor DLI. Now, we can argue endlessly, is it 25% outdoor, indoor, or is it 50%? What is it? But if you figure 50%, that's pretty good, because I can do that math. Because basically the greenhouse reduces the amount of light that comes into the greenhouse. So you only have about 50% of the outside inside. So if it's 5 to 10 moles per day outside, as it is, of course, the northern tundra country of the Dakotas, basically what you end up with is about nothing inside, about 2 moles per day. If you take a look at kind of in the Midwest and across the central part of the US, you end up with about 5 to 10, about 10 to 15 out, and probably 10 to you have 5 to 10 inside, so you don't have any. So it is very dark. Now, if we can compare that to the same time down in Central America, where many of our unrooted cuttings originate with the stock plants, and stock plant production is about basically maximum growth. It's not about optimizing. We're just basically trying to push as much carbohydrates into those plants to give you a carbohydrate-rich plant that we can ship north to where it's dark and we're going to root them. So you can really clearly understand that why we're growing stock in this Central America region is because their light intensity outside is running, probably 30, 40, 50 moles per day, depending upon exactly where they are. And of course, you put it inside a greenhouse, cut it that in half, and still it's like 4 times as much light as you're seeing up north. And that's why we don't do geranium production in the north, up in Minnesota, Wisconsin, or Michigan anymore. We basically do it all down in Central and South America because it's about light. And the strategy in stock is we want to grow lots of biomass. So grow it where there's light. Unfortunately, we're rooting it up north where there's not as much. So we have to really address this low light period. So let's take a look at just so we understand what we're talking about and look at regional DLI. This graph basically shows a number of different locations and what is the monthly moles per day that you should expect. And of course, in the as you get into Seattle, dark areas, Spokane, and you have very low during November, December, January, and February. It's under 5 moles per day. And of course, during the summer, you start getting upwards to 20, 25 moles per day where you are. Of course, Miami, sunny Miami, is sitting at, it never really drops below about 12, 13 moles per day because it is just a sunny place. And this is basically how much light's inside the greenhouse. This is the DLI inside the greenhouse. So let's really focus on November, December, January, because if we get started well in young plant production, because that's what we're talking about here today, our success at finish is much easier and much more profitable because we have more consistency and we have more synchronous development. We take a look at different areas and then ask, okay, so where do we need? We need about, on average, about 12 moles per day. That's the optimum target that we're trying to shoot for. And so from about November through about the middle of March, most of the US production is still pretty much below that 12 mole threshold. But okay, so the real question is not, okay, so how much light is in the greenhouse? The question is, how much light do you need to add? Because that's where the money hits the road. And so let's look at how much we have. And what this graph shows is how much supplemental light would you need during different months of the year to achieve a target of 12 moles per day. And of course, Seattle, Spokane, you're basically shooting in December for looking at about 8 moles of added light. During January, you're at about 7.5, let's call it 8. Whereas if you're down in Dallas or down out in California, you're probably in that same December, January period, you're right around 2 to 2.5. So where you are makes a big difference. And of course, this is why you need to talk to your partner and really understand how much light you need to really achieve that target, because not lighting enough really doesn't do the job. You need to make sure that you're putting out enough to be economically viable. Okay, now sometimes they get confused and you'll talk about the daily moles per day versus the accumulative DLI. And of course, that's really important to understand because over time, you can accumulate enough DLI, moles per month, moles per year, to achieve a specific amount of carbohydrates. Because remember, think about it, the more DLI, the more carbohydrates. So either you can increase crop time, which is what a lot of us do up in the north, or you can add light and decrease the crop time, because what you're looking for in your 4-6 weeks of rooting time or plug production time is you're looking for how many moles of light do I need to create a marketable product, a product I can transplant successfully into a finished container. So this is where you need to kind of understand, how much DLI do I need to add? And then that fits into your crop time. How much time do I want to put on the bench? And of course, that is like every grower says, less is better. If I can get a week, I'm good. If I get 3 days, who cares? So really, you've got to be understanding what is the trade-off there. There's some excellent work that Roberto did, and he talks about what is different crops, what is the moles per day to give you a high quality product, is the minimum a good or a high quality. And this is where we kind of hit on the 12 moles, because of course, the more moles you put per day, the higher the cost is to actually run them. So, and to buy them and install them and all of the associated costs. So the return on investment or the ownership cost goes up as you start putting more and more moles. And so, if you're into leafy greens, you're probably up in the 22, 24, 26 moles per day. You can even be higher, up into 30, 35, depending upon what you're trying to achieve. So in bedding plant seedling production, under young plant production, we're really looking at that. About 12 moles is kind of our target range, because you need to do it on the worst, darkest period. This is why we really focus on how much light do we need for December, January, and February if we're in production. If you're not in production in December, forget that. If you're not in production in January, forget that. If you're only starting in February, well, that's a really different number that you need to be supplementing to hit that 12 moles per day target. So let's think about that before you decide on how much light do I need, because just putting more light is not going to give you more return on investment, because there is a plateau where more light doesn't make any difference, whether you're talking about cannabis, you're talking about vegetables, lettuce, or even rooting and growing petunias. So it's really important. A good example of some work that was done by Roberto and Eric many years ago, we're basically just putting a little bit of light on, you basically can reduce the crop time by about 7 days. You know, in this case, if you notice, by just adding light, and some crops need more light to get the 7-day benefit. So this is where you really need to understand what's the crop, what are we trying to do. Let's shift gears now to really where one of the growth opportunities is for precision growing. You know, as growers now have ads, they need to hit specific market windows. They need to be on time all the time. Photoperiod manipulation and photoperiod control is going to be progressively more critical with the introduction of more and more perennials that we can flower in the spring when the customers are there to buy them. It's going to be more important to understand how can we use photoperiod to generate additional sales. And also, if we need sales in the July, August period, we need product in the stores, how can we manipulate the photoperiods to produce the plant on schedule when we need it, and not just when nature and God decided it should bloom. Echinacea, poster child, but you can also basically look at some of your other composites. Gaillardia, Rudbeckia also do this. So this we're just going to talk about is that if you have short days, less than 12 hours, notice it's vegetative and it basically doesn't have any flowering because it is a long day plant. So we can use photoperiod to control the vegetative growth, but you also have to be careful that if you use a night interruption, notice that you end up with a stick in the pot. One single flower, one single stem. Not very commercially acceptable in this day and age. So basically you can use photoperiod to manipulate the shoot and root ratios and also improve basal branching, because anyone that has grown echinacea as short day, then move them to the natural long days of summer, knows that they branch prolifically compared to that plant that they stuck and grew under long days, which was stick in the pot. So you can really use this trick of photoperiod to really give you a higher value product for a relatively limited input. So you've really to keep in mind, let's keep thinking that summer flowering plants are long day plants. So if you have problems where your plants are just, you know, your spring flowering stuff is all just stick in a pot, what should you be doing? You should probably be using some short days to induce basal branching and delay flowering. That was my whole PhD, was how do I delay flowering in carnations to get increasing yield? We could triple the yield by manipulating the photoperiod because we had more branches. If you have fall flowering, those are short day induced flowers. So that short days will trigger the flowering. So therefore you want to use long days to keep them vegetative and get bulk on them. And so that you can then go to the short days, celosia being one of the poster children. If you have spring flowering, you need this bulking, and that's what we do with echinacea. And of course, we've got information on how do you bulk plants, what's the best bulking method, are they obligate or facultative, and this is all pointy head information, but working with your partners, you can basically get the information that you need. Not every light bulb will work for photoperiod control. Eric Runkle published some great data basically recommending if you're using these lights, it will work if you've got a short day induction versus long day plants. So you want to make sure that you're using the right light to give you the right response, because the different wavelengths of light by these different lights trigger or steer different behavior of the plants. So, Bill, hopefully I'm giving you some ideas of how you can manage the 3 Ps of photomorphogenesis, the habit and size, photosynthesis, carbohydrate production, because that's really important, and finally photoperiod, which gives us more finely tuned date of flower, size of the plant, whether it's branch, whether it's straight up, how we can manipulate it. And we can do this with different light qualities. We can do it with duration. There's a lot of very pointy head, complicated information. And that's kind of the rabbit hole I think most people get stuck in. And that's why it's important to have a partner who can basically help walk you through this little nightmare. But, with anything, we have to ask the question, with such great benefits from LED lighting. So we can steer them to go this way, and we can start them this way, and we can turn them that way. We can move them all around using what could possibly go wrong? Well, anyone that has turned on LED lights will tell you the number one thing that goes wrong is the plants turn yellow and they look like they're dead. Massive nutrient deficiency. And of course, if you stand back and say, well, yeah, I'm basically putting the pedal to the metal, pushing the gas with more light to get the plants to grow more vigorously. And plant growth is a combination of carbohydrate production and nutrients working together to give us plant growth. Okay. So if you got all the carbohydrates, but you didn't fix the nutrient problem, what do you got? Nothing. You got someone sitting in the driveway with their foot on the gas and their other foot on the brake, and you're just sitting there spinning your wheels. So one of the things that goes wrong that people really need to be thinking about is their nutrition program basically has to be reevaluated and reconsidered and stepped up a lot to basically increase, because you've increased your growth rate and you're still feeding right here. Guess what you've got? Nothing. But if you bring up your feed levels, all of a sudden you've got the two in balance and away you go. Because remember, for years, you've been developing this nutrition feed program, when you feed, what you feed, how much you feed, all of these different aspects based on the fact that it was dark in January and it was bright in July. In fact, all of you have done this. You change your feed program as you go through the seasons, right? Because the light gets better. Well, all of a sudden you put on 12 moles per day. Those plants are growing like they are in the middle of May, when it's ambient is always 12 moles. So what happens? Well, the young leaves basically become chlorotic. Notice the older foliage is nice and green because there's plenty of nitrogen. Nitrogen accumulates in the old foliage, but it's the young leaves that just don't have those nutrients. The middle and lower leaves might get some purpling, and of course, one of the things we see is it appears usually in vegetative cuttings, usually about a week after sticking. And there's a reason for it. We'll get to that in a second. And then also in seedlings, we start seeing it probably about at the second true leaf. The first true leaf usually is okay, but at the second and subsequent true leaves, you start seeing all of these problems. And like in petunias, when you start doing this, you'll start seeing it a little bit later, but the purpling will definitely be in the oldest foliage first. The rule of thumb is once you turn chlorotic, it's really difficult to correct. Remember how I said you really want during young plant production, you want to make sure everything is uniform and consistent, because if it's not, then you're just spending all of your time, which is money, trying to fix a problem you should not have had. So let's really, when you turn on lights, and this is an easy fix, it's just a different mindset. The iron and manganese, and it's not iron, and it's not manganese, it's iron and manganese, and we'll see in a minute why, is basically becomes limiting, and now this is deficiency. When I see this white, I'm basically, people say it's iron. I said, no, it's not, it's manganese. How do you know? Well, I put iron on it and it keeps coming back. I put it on, it's like a drug. I turn green, I turn yellow, I turn green, I turn yellow. Well, its reason is that iron and manganese can be interchanged. In a minute, you'll see where. And so, but it's not stable because they don't need it. It doesn't work. You got to have a balance of iron and manganese. And it's really important in our crops to have this iron manganese balance inside the plants. Okay. So obviously you've got to up your game and feed more iron and manganese, and usually use a supplemental. Most vegetative propagators and seedling producers do have a custom micro package for their operation, their water, to basically deliver the manganese and iron that they need. But Phosphorus is also important, and it's very important in the carbohydrate. So you get all these sugars produced, but sugars by themselves are useless. You have to get them into starch and carbohydrates and proteins and all this other stuff that allows plants to grow. And phosphorus sits in the middle of making that happen. So it's very important. That's why these three nutrients, manganese, Mn, iron, and phosphorus, are critical in successful lighting installations. Now, just a note, why some unrooted cuttings and not others? Well, in the unrooted cuttings are growing very, very rapidly, and manganese and iron uptake is fairly slow because it's taken up through the roots, and it has to be translocated from the roots to the leaves to the growing point. So it just takes time. And so if they're harvesting cuttings very aggressively during the peak season, you just don't have enough time to get enough iron, manganese, and phosphorus into those cuttings, even though they're putting it on at fairly high rates, to get them in there so there's enough to make them green in the bag. But then when you set them down and put them under stress of very high light conditions, bam, they basically go deficient, because all of a sudden you push the pedal to the metal and the plants are growing with all the light, but then there's not sufficient reserves. So that's why you need to really be focused. Now, if you'll excuse me, Bill, while we go and point ahead and kind of help people understand why this is important. So let's go on a voyage. Remember the magic school bus when we were young, and she shrunk everyone down? Well, that's what we're going to do. We're going to shrink ourselves down into a leaf. So we're going to take a leaf, and now we're going to go and get into it, and we're going to look at a cross section of the leaf. So we're literally cutting across it. And what you have is you've got this upper epidermis, and then you got what look like sausages hanging down. Well, those are the palisade layer. That's where the chlorophyll is sitting. And now let's go zoom in on that chlorophyll layer. And this is what it looks like as a diagrammatic representation of the green glob. In there is the chlorophyll A, and then there's all of the mechanism that does all of this magical stuff that we're not going to get into detail because it's really, okay, so let's just talk about his magical stuff, Bill, okay? Not important in growing, but what is important is when we actually get down into that magical stuff and we actually see what's happening and where it's needed. Now, all of you, we're going to do a little science here. So, hopefully it'll be fast so you won't get too long of a nap. But there's two different, photosynthesis has two parts, photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. Remember, we take CO2 plus water and we produce carbohydrates and oxygen, right? That's the process. Okay, well, the process is of course a little bit different than what we always talk about, because photosystem 2, which they discovered after photosystem 1, by the way, that's why it's 2, is the first step. And the first step of photosystem 2 is it basically splits the water into oxygen and water and hydrogen. So we basically end up, that's where the oxygen comes off, but that whole reaction occurs within the photosystem 2 system. And manganese, Mn, is the central nutrient that drives this whole process. So if you don't have manganese, that process slows down. And what that process is, when you hit the photon, a light photon hits that, it basically starts triggering the breaking of water into oxygen and hydrogen. It basically then starts creating an energy electron cascade, and this is called the Z scheme, because it basically comes up and then it basically cavalcades down into photosystem 2. And in photosystem 1. Photosystem 1 is where the sugars are produced. And in the middle of that photosystem 1 system is iron. So when the electrons comes cascading down from photosystem 2 into photosystem 1, and it basically needs iron to make it, to take the CO2 and turn it into a sugar. Okay, so if all of a sudden you don't have manganese, you run out of gas because there's no electrons to drive the carbohydrate production. If you don't have iron, you don't produce the carbohydrates, and the plants look anemic and almost dead. Okay, but as anything, you get all these carbohydrates formed, but notice you've got these two arrows with P, And there's two compounds, NADP, which is critical with phosphorus. It's an energy. It basically helps convert the carbohydrates into, or the sugars into carbohydrates and complex carbohydrates, and then start getting growth. And then also it is involved with ATP, and ATP is involved with the whole complex of energy growing the plants. And one of the things that people always see is if they get the fertilization right, the phosphorus, the manganese, and the iron all right, they cut crop times dramatically, because suddenly you got the whole process is working better and more aggressively, and so you get more carbohydrates. So it's really important to have those, all of the things, you know, as they say, all the cylinders banging. And in fact, if you look at that bill, it kind of looks like car cylinders, right? It's kind of like a 2-cylinder engine. So you got to have all of those cylinders banging. So that was the point he had. Everyone can wake up now and try to come back and get out of the out of the rabbit hole. But some other things that we see is the uniformity. Suddenly the weaker plants can take off and start growing, so that, you know, the last 5 to 10% of your crop that a lot of times is thrown out or sold as subpar or just doesn't ever end up with market actually becomes part of the marketable yield, so that you increase the usable plants, which always translates, because you've got all of the input costs sitting there in the tray, and if you don't sell it, you lose a lot of money. Work that I've done over the years show that for every plant you throw out, you basically consume the profit on 3 or 4 plants you did sell. So throwing plants out is a very pricey operation. The growth rate is very important, because you have to think of it both. They're going to grow faster, but they're also going to be bigger if you put too much light on. So you really need to be thinking, how is I going to change my growth, my overall growth regulator program, my planting dates? You know, how am I going to modify my production program? And it's not uncommon to be taking time off in young plants and time off in finished, because the plants are timed better, they're going to grow better, which is always a good thing, because that gives you one more turn to achieve additional revenue in the season of spring. The average daily temperature, you got to kind of watch that. If you've been a high pressure sodium grower and you go to LEDs, you remember in the very first early slides, we talked about high pressure sodium having a lot of radiant energy coming off, so that the heat of those lights can significantly impact the average daily temperature of that greenhouse. So you got to watch to make sure that the greenhouse isn't getting too cool and slowing everything down. Also, because you're not using radiant heat to warm up the leaves, begonias and vinca are two that really benefit from this. Leaf sizes will be a little bit smaller, so you may have to adjust the amount of ammonia you put on just to make sure you got the leaf size. Overall, you're going to have to modify the climate a little bit, because the plants are growing more vigorously and they're really taking off. So let's take a look at, you know, making that LED decision. Let's really sum this up so that you don't feel like you're going down a rabbit hole without the information. Number one, it's really important to know who your partner is. Who is going to help solve you? Is it the guy on Amazon who's going to answer all of your growing questions, or is it the person who is going to show up and help you make the right decisions? An important part of the investment, because the investment is not a light investment. It's a heavy dollar investment, but the payback is there. Anyone that's done it says, why didn't we do it earlier? And why didn't we do more? Those are the two conclusions I always get from growers that put in an acre or a half acre of lights. They always go, why didn't we do this earlier? Why didn't I do more? Because the benefits are so dramatic. Sit down and write, what are we trying to solve? What are you, because then that way you're sure that you're going to get the return on investment. You know, are you a biomass producer, or are you trying to optimize production? Because those are very different. I think we showed that, you know, if you're into biomass, you know, 30, 40 moles per day might be your target. If you're basically optimizing production, maybe 12 moles. Very different dollars and cents in your lighting installation. Are you trying to sole source? Meaning, are you going to grow in a warehouse? Are you warehouse growing? Or are you doing supplementary lighting where you're using sunshine to give you a certain number of moles? Very different economics and very different lighting program. What is the overall return on investment that you need or you expect? And make sure that you look at not just how much money you save from electricity, because that's very short-sighted. You need to look at your improved yield. How much is every additional plant worth to you? Every additional young plant that costs you, say, 40 cents to produce, remember, is yielding a $2, $3, or $4 finished plant, depending upon what you're talking about. So you really have to be looking at what is the value of lighting in young plants, which I've always said was much more cost effective than lighting in finished at this point. So what is the value of really throwing some serious light on young plants, because you get more turns, and you get longer term benefit. That was one of my graduate students. Basically, once you increase the growth rate of a petunia at the 2-leaf stage, it perpetuates itself forever compared to not doing it. So make sure that you get the improved yield, the increased turn, and the overall crop timing being improved. How many weeks are you going to light? In some parts of the world, if you light for 2 or 3 weeks, that might not be economically viable. But if you have to light for all 10, 15 weeks of your spring young plant season, then all of a sudden it becomes very economically valuable very fast. What's your peak target moles per day? Because remember, you can use intensity times duration to get your moles per day. So you might have a lower intensity, but you're going to run it for longer, because DLI, moles per day, is an cumulative over that 24-hour period. So really look at how that works out. Remember to look at your total CapEx, the LED fixtures plus the infrastructure. If you are a greenfield where you have no power on site to drive high pressure sodium lights, the price of electricity bringing power into the facility can almost double the cost of your installation. So be really careful and watch what you're doing, because there still is an ROI, but be aware of the fact that infrastructure and just the delays in getting wires to your greenhouse can be kind of long. The operating costs, how much does it cost to run these lights? And then also the control system, how are you going to control them? How are you going to turn them on? How are you going to turn them off? So Bill, why don't you tell us where else we can get some of the additional information?
Absolutely. I'm still kind of spinning from all that information. I do have some thoughts on what you shared, but before I get into that, yes, definitely encourage everyone viewing to check out some of our other tech on demand resources. We have a ton of slideshow presentations on just about every topic that'll help train your team, and you can find that on SlideShare. We do have podcasts. We've done 2 podcast series now. I think we have almost 70 episodes. The most recent is a Tech on Demand podcast brought to you by Grower Talks. And you can find those resources online. You can find the STEM podcast at Ball Seed and Tech on Demand at the Grower Talks website. Definitely follow Ball Seed on LinkedIn. Try to post information just about daily, relevant information to whatever you're producing at that time of year. Our technical team deals with a lot of questions, and we try to capture those and share them back out to the world, since very rarely is a question just on the mind of one grower. And then definitely encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter. Comes out every Friday and delivers the information when it's needed, at the right time, and the right information. So you can find that again at the Grower Talk site if you go into the newsletter subscription page. And we also have videos on YouTube. Like I said, podcasts, a ton of information out there from the Tech on Demand team. And you can find us on Facebook as Greenhouse Tech Team. No lack of information and resources. But Will, I did want to just touch on a few things that you covered. When you talk about cutting crop times dramatically, I think that catches everybody's attention. And then you pair that with increased yield and uniformity, and it really does sound like LEDs do offer a lot of solutions. You mentioned Grower Talks LED supplement, which is LED lighting in propagation, which is spot on with what you're just discussing. And like Will said, it's Eric Runkle and a host of other contributors working through the research that's been done recently, and delivering it concisely in 24 pages. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Um, so yeah, Will, I definitely thank you for all your time. There's a lot of good information. I think what you shared about the question that everyone needs to consider is why, and what are the goals you're trying to achieve with changing your lighting technology, and that does require some time. And well recommended you sit down and make a list, and I would second that. And it's like any project you're going to tackle. First, you need to know what the goal is. And that's going to be specific to your operation. And having that list of goals is really going to help when you meet with a lighting partner. Probably won't help if you type it into the Amazon search engine and come up with some cheap LEDs. I think it's going to be much more effective when you talk to a true LED partner who understands our industry. And Will gave a lot of information. There's definitely going to be more questions. He shared some of the considerations that you need, and there's a lot more. And information continues to come. This is ongoing research, ongoing information. It's really fast moving, but at Tech on Demand, we are going to do our best to help keep you informed. And I would imagine that Will's going to be back many times to continue this discussion. So if you have questions, you can post them in the comments under this video. You can email us. You can contact, folks at Ball Seed. There's really a lot of different folks within the Tech on Demand community you can reach out to ask these questions. But Will, thank you so much for your time and your knowledge on this subject. And I don't know if you have anything to say before we close.
No, it's I just I was fast and furious, and so I really encourage people to go back and listen to it again, because it's kind of like a Chinese lunch. Every time you have it, it tastes a little bit better, and you better understand what it is that you just ate. But it is something that has huge benefits if you understand what your problem is. And I see failure because they didn't understand what their problem is, and then they solved it incorrectly, and then they're disappointed. And other people who have identified their problems, identified what solutions that are possible, and have made the right decision based on what their needs and their opportunities and how much money they have to spend, and they basically see huge payback in the first year. So I really encourage people to get out there and really do a little bit of research on how can I be a better grower, more cost-effective grower by using LED lights.
Excellent, excellent. And to everyone who's viewing this, thank you so much for your time. And we will put a link to the slides in the video show notes. So I guess with that, we will let you move on with your day, with your head full of questions and information about LEDs. And good luck out there. Have a fantastic season.